Welcome, everyone. This is the Straight from a Scientist podcast. We are recording live from Nashville, Music City, with Dr. Jordan Grigor of the School for Science and Math at Vanderbilt. Welcome to the podcast.
Hey, yeah, it's good to be here. It's nice to talk to you about science.
Thank you so much for coming on. I agree. I appreciate you bringing me into your labs and your aquarium space. I can't wait to see the fish tank later if you let me.
Yeah, definitely. We'll go see it. This is like an office right now, or like, a conference room. Our aquarium is through in the classroom, so I can show you that afterwards.
Excellent. So, Dr. Grigor, you have researched a bunch of things related to marine biology, right?
Yeah.
Briefly, we talked about zooplankton and the difference between Arctic plankton versus like a Florida type Gulf Stream plankton. Could you tell us a little bit about your research and why you think it's important and what you're excited about right now?
Awesome. Yeah, cool. So, yeah, you're right to say that I study zooplankton. I've been studying zooplankton for several years now. And zooplankton are the animal part of the plankton. Okay, so the word plankton itself is kind of an interesting word. It comes from a Greek word, which means to drift. Okay, so the plankton include organisms that just drift with the ocean currents. Okay, but some of those organisms are massively important. In fact, most or all of them are very important, So what I did was I looked at the animal part of the plankton in the Arctic, and I tried to work out how these animals were adapted to a life in the Arctic. And those adaptations for a life in the Arctic are very different to the adaptations maybe found in the same species in much warmer waters.
And do you think these species would be able to adapt to perhaps a warming climate that we see right now in the Arctic, especially been in the news lately?
Yeah, right. So a lot of people in Arctic research spend their lives answering those questions, right? Mm-hmm. So firstly, let me say that zooplankton contains lots of different species. Some of them are very closely related to animals that you might know a little bit better, okay, like crabs, okay? And then the ones I studied in my PhD were called arrowworms. So what these are kind of like long, skinny, slender worms that live in the water. Mm. And the answer to your question is really, to the answer to the question, will each species be able to respond to climate change? It depends on the species.
Right.
Some species are going to be winners and some are going to be losers. But there's definitely big ecosystem shifts that could happen with big numbers of species suffering,
Now, these plankton are really important because they're major food sources for the ecosystem, right?
Yeah.
So what would happen hypothetically, do you think, if some of these species collapse in the Arctic? Do you see full devastation, or maybe there are other food sources that major browsing species can rely on? Okay.
So, yeah, that's another good question. So let me talk about copepods, right? And have you heard of copepods?
Yeah. It's. I thought it was copiopod. Am I?
It's pronounced copepod.
Okay,
but,
I've been saying that wrong my entire life. People are probably giving me weird looks when I say that.
No, that's cool. There's a lot of these words, that are kind of difficult to say. The phylum name for the animals I studied was Ketognafa, right? Nobody gets that right. Yeah.
All right.
But let me go back to copepods. And copepods are the most abundant multicellular animals in the world. Okay, so more abundant than insects.
Wow.
And they live in the oceans, and they live in also freshwater habitats as well. Mm. In the Arctic, you have these copepods which are in a specific genus, right? And that genus is Calanus. And these copepods, some of them, there's like 3 main species, and 2 of those species are very important in the diets of birds, such as the little auk. Okay. That's the reason for that is because those animals are filled with fat supplies. So you will have birds, you'll have fish, you'll have whales that will just munch on these copepods all day long. But these ones that have lots of fat are potentially also at threat from global warming. Okay, they might suffer if the temperature increases by 2 to 3 degrees Celsius. Their populations might decrease, and obviously that would have effects on their predators. What they think might happen is that another species of copepod called Calanus fimarchicus might move up, further north. And there will be more of those guys, but they don't have as much fat.
Oh, no.
So that's not as good for their predators. And you'll probably see lots of changes, in the abundances of different predators as a result of that. So,
That's really interesting. Do you happen to know if that's the omega-3 fats that everyone always wants to get in their diet, get enriched.
Yeah, exactly. Fish. That's it. So
the good fats.
The good fats, right? Just in the same way, the good fats. A lot of animals move to the Arctic to eat these animals that have these good fats, these monounsaturated fatty acids, And one of the things that we're seeing, is that, for example, a gray whale might actually benefit from having many more of these smaller copepods, So you might have more whales in the Arctic. That might actually happen for many reasons. If you look at the killer whale, which isn't actually a whale, okay? Mm-hmm. But that could be a winner in climate change in some ways. The reason why is because it's generally scared of the ice. So when the ice retreats, it will move further north. But again, you can't say exactly for sure what will happen, with each individual species, but it's clear to see that some will win and some will lose,
That's really interesting. Yeah, I guess people always think of it as a net full negative, and then there are people who say, no, there are going to be positives to climate change. In general, it's very unpredictable, though, and that's mainly what we're worried about, right? Yeah. Is if food sources dry up, the killer whales may actually have an issue. And I think people are still questioning climate change, and I would rather they not, because it does seem like the full scientific consensus is that climate change is occurring.
Yeah.
Right. And
97% of scientists say that climate change is caused by humans, right? 97% is a big number, man. Yeah. And the fact that the opinion of the remaining 3% is given as much attention in the media is maybe a little bit nonsensible, because if you're amongst your friends, okay, and 97% have one opinion and 3% have the other, in your friendship group, that 3% isn't as loud.
Yep. Sometimes, yeah. Depends on who you're friendly with, definitely. And I mean, in terms of other scientific theories, which generally all these things are theories, and when we say theories in science, we mean something that is testable and is has been established generally, and is basically the equivalent of a fact. And that's, to me, what climate change is, and to 97% of scientists,
but
that's what climate change is.
That's one of the problems that we're having, is that there's a lot of terms which vary in meaning between scientists and the general public. Okay, so theory is one of them. Significance is another.
Right.
Words that definitely have a specific meaning in science, and you wouldn't say something was significant until you've actually done stats on it, But I mean, even before I really started thinking like this and talking like this, significance was definitely a word that I used just for something that was it seems like visually something might be happening.
Yeah.
But have you done the stats to really verify that? If not, don't use the word significant.
Yep. We basically get brandished all the time in our training, PhD training. So a little bit about your research, and then I'd love to move on to the education part, because one thing you're working on is trying to fill that gap between scientific knowledge and the terms that we as scientists use and how the public perceives it, right?
Sure, yeah.
Actually, let's just go ahead and talk about that now. You're educating high school students, essentially, in it sounds like a very intense program of study. What do you try to accomplish there, and are there any specific goals, or do you generally just try and introduce the students to science as a whole and the scientific method?
Yeah, so what we're trying to do here at the School for Science and Math at Vanderbilt, based in Nashville, Tennessee, is give high school students an exposure to kind of real science, as it's done by researchers. I'm a postdoc. Okay, I did my PhD at Laval University in Quebec City, Canada, and I work with a team of 2 other instructors that also have PhDs. And we really we teach about the stuff that we studied in our fields. Okay, but we also teach about a bunch of other things. So I'm of course a marine biologist, but to these students that come to our course, I really teach about biology in general. I also teach them, generally how to write papers, and lots of stuff that will really help them in their lives. But how our program is set up is that 4 groups of students from public schools in Nashville, attend the program. And they come, each class attends the program 1 day per week. And they miss out on their normal school day in order to come here. So then they have to catch up for that, for the school day they missed. And they have also homework for us.
Ouch.
Ouch. So that's so that for real. So that's definitely true that you say it's intensive.
Yeah.
But they come and they make this decision early in their careers to follow, at least for the next few years, to follow science and math. Okay. Because that's a decision that they make when they're in 8th grade. And then they attend our program from 9th grade all the way through to 12th. In that time, we start by really asking the question, how do you pose a scientific question? Okay. And then you go from there. Okay. You really end up doing projects with them. Finally, towards the end of the program, we put them in labs in Vanderbilt. And they learn a lot that you would generally probably not learn until your bachelor's or maybe even your master's.
Right.
So, yeah.
Or maybe I haven't even learned it now.
Maybe you have. A lot of it is kind of like, and it's a shock, right? It's a culture shock going into a lab for the first time.
Absolutely, yeah. That's why a lot of PhD admissions committees are valuing like the lab experience so much higher than, say, GRE scores. Some schools like Michigan just cut out their GRE scores. They think they're not valid anymore because it's all about the lab experience. It's all about, have you immersed yourself in the culture and are you comfortable with that? So one of my questions has to be, how do you get an 8th grader to commit to this when they're like, what is their life like that encourages them or pushes them, drives them towards learning more about science? How do we inspire those kids?
I think that, there's kids that do get exposure to science things pretty young these days, right? So a lot of our kids, even when they come in the program, have already done like robotics competitions and stuff, right? Yeah. So there's a lot of these like really smart kids that are watching things on TV, right? That we have kids that go online on YouTube to watch science videos instead of watch like music videos, And that's not all kids. Like that wasn't me when I was that age.
Not myself.
But definitely these kids have that interest, from the beginning, and they're willing to spend the next several years learning the skills that they need, to really become researchers, And some of them decide in the process that, the scientific experience was great, but they don't necessarily want to follow academia for the rest of their lives, but they still follow something that this education will help with in some way. Mm-hmm. So we teach them how to give presentations. We teach them how to write papers. We teach them how to communicate with other scientists, and in the case of the aquarium, how to make YouTube videos and stuff like that, like life skills.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
That's really, really neat. I think science communication, of course, I'm a little biased here, but I think science communication is paramount, especially in this day and age. And I think one of the more important topics that scientists need to reach out on is climate change. And just to show the overwhelming majority of scientists actually do agree, and they're not just like some paid hacks or shills or whatever, some people in the media are calling them. They're real people, really studying things and working in the field and making these discoveries and working tireless hours. Absolutely.
Yeah. So let me tell you a statistic. Okay.
Excellent.
So there are papers by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Okay. And that might be the go-to organization, to find out what's really happening with global warming and climate change. Okay. They said in one of their papers, okay, warming of the climate system is unequivocal. And since the 1950s, many of the observed changes are unprecedented over decades to millennia. The atmosphere and ocean have warmed, the amounts of snow and ice have diminished, and sea level has risen. The period from 1983 to 2012 was likely the warmest 30-year period of the last 1,400 years in the Northern Hemisphere. And they have an idea about what the climate was like in 1,400 years from things like ice cores, okay? Isotope analysis. So what a kind of scary thought that this time period, covering 30 years, is higher than anything that's happened in 1,400 years. And these kids, are growing up at this time, They have, firstly, they have an opportunity now, to share that information, share that statistic with their peers, okay? And they also have an opportunity to join organizations, to help reduce the effects of climate change, volunteer to protect coral reefs, things like that. There's a lot of opportunities that the young people have, and we have as well, to really reduce our carbon footprint. And what I try to do at the SSMV is really tell them that there's things you can do. Right. There are things you can do right now. You can go home. You don't even have to go home. You can do it here, but then you can go home and then you can do it there too.
Yep. So you might you might almost say we have an obligation rather than an opportunity too, right?
Yeah.
I think we are all people on this planet, and we will all be affected, some disproportionately, definitely, but it doesn't mean that we shouldn't worry about it. So what are some of those things that like I can do when I'm home or when I'm here? What are the like everyday things that you could maybe tweak a little bit to make a big difference over time when you compound these?
Yeah. Okay. So the number one thing, right, that I would say you can do quickly, is recycle if you're not recycling already. Mm-hmm. Okay. But you probably are recycling already. But honestly, in Nashville, I'm just going to call out, they don't have the recycling services, and other places too, that do exist in other places, right. In Europe, for example, okay, there's charges in certain countries, if you don't recycle what you're supposed to recycle, if you throw it in the trash, penalties. Okay. So, but the reason, of course, that you should recycle is because when you don't recycle, it goes to landfill. Mm-hmm. It totally pollutes the environment, It can be really bad for the animals that live in that area, near the landfill. But it also releases carbon dioxide emissions, Mm-hmm. And anything releasing carbon dioxide emissions is something we would try and aim to reduce. Mm-hmm. So cars as well. Think about the cars you drive. Think about, but the thing is, like, it's very easy for a scientist to say this. I'm going to say it at that point. It's very, very easy. Yep. These things need to be kind of incorporated into people's lives. And when people already have a routine, that they've been doing for a long time, it's hard to break. Right. But I think with statistics like that, we do have to change. Change is necessary, Absolutely. And if we don't change, and then the world does really degrade, we are going to feel pretty bad later on.
Yeah, definitely. And it's something that I think about all the time, but I always wonder how much of a difference is this making, sort of thing. And you can get very apathetic about it. Does that happen to you even sometimes, I wonder? And then it just seems like it can almost never be enough. But at the same time, if we do inspire like widespread change, all these things compound. Yeah. This happened because it's small changes compounding over time, over decades. And to reverse that, we probably have to do small changes compounded over time.
Decades, right? So there's a lot of people. There's a lot of people in the world, which is a big part of the reason that we are in the situation we're in right now. Right. Okay, but that also could be seen as a good thing in some ways, because if each person makes a small change, there is that group effect. But just to go back to something you said, whether I think as a scientist that I can really do something, there was something that was said by Leonardo DiCaprio, right, in that movie that he filmed called Before the Flood. And he said, I'm not going to quote him specifically, but he said something like, it must be really depressing being a scientist, And if he was a scientist, he'd wake up every day depressed. But, you won't be able to be a very efficient scientist if you do wake up every day depressed. We have to believe that there's still time to change things, And there's a bunch of different emission scenarios, for the future, carbon dioxide, greenhouse gas emission scenarios. We don't necessarily need to head towards the worst one, If we aim to reduce our carbon dioxide emissions, we'll end up with, at least not the worst case scenario, There will still probably be detrimental effects of climate change because there is greenhouse gas emissions, that are still to kick in, the effects of which are still to kick in. There is maybe a time lag between when something's emitted and when it really begins to affect the climate. But with all the new clean technologies, renewable energy, potentially even geoengineering, we can make the world a much better place.
We can kind of stop some of the damage, you would think.
Yeah, for sure.
And then also from your research, it seems unclear as to what exact effects that's going to happen on these populations that are so sensitive. So it definitely seems like it's going to perturb like their balance, and it's going to upset maybe some of the species diversity perhaps, or some of the, we're going to lose some of those omega-3 producing species, and that's going to mean them is going to get more expensive and harder to get those omega-3s that everyone loves. It may not be all bad, like you said, but we really just don't understand it. Do you think those species will be able to adapt in time if we're able to slow climate change?
Again, it probably depends on the species, but it's a very broad question, and there's a lot of people that, again, spend a lot of time answering that, the specific question is that change happening too fast, to really kind of disallow these species from adapting in time,
they can't catch up.
For some species that might be the case, for others maybe not. There's species that can evolve rapidly. Okay, like look at the flu.
Every year changes.
Changes every year. other species too. But let me tell you another. So you mentioned there that, obviously, if these copepods and if these zooplankton suffer due to climate change, their predators suffer. Okay, some of those predators are things that we like to eat. Okay, right. Like fish. So we definitely might have to change our diets. Mm-hmm. In the Arctic, there's northern people that depend on the sea ice to hunt. Okay, mm-hmm. And when the sea ice disappears, they have to change their entire life fast. Yeah. It's maybe it takes a longer time for us to really start suffering where we live, but they suffer quickly. Mm-hmm. Let me tell you about something else called ocean acidification. Do you know about that?
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that. And it's related to CO2 emissions, right?
Yeah.
And it's because of CO2.
Yeah, it's because of CO2.
Maybe you'd explain that much better than I.
No, I'm sure you can explain it really well. Go for it. Yeah, go for it.
So as far as I know, CO2 is absorbed by the ocean. When it is absorbed, it can become a solid, but it alters the pH of the oceans. And so we're getting this acidification, which wrecks our coral reefs. It makes them unable to bloom. Is that it? And some people think it's actually just actively destroying them. But then coral are a substrate for so they're basically habitat for all sorts of fish and probably zooplankton that I don't really know about.
You work in pharmaceutics, right?
Pharmacology.
Pharmacology.
Yeah, exactly.
A little different.
Yeah, I know pH in maybe a cellular system, but
you're as a pharmacologist, you're interested in different drugs that might come around in the future, right?
Generally, yeah, we're researching new therapies. My specific research is on Alzheimer's disease. Right. So we want to know of new therapies that we can use to maybe stave off Alzheimer's disease onset, maybe earlier in life,
okay,
or work towards some sort of cure. But a lot of that has to happen catching it earlier in onset. And a lot of these treatments that we have today are kind of band-aids to this late stage symptom showing disease. And it's kind of how I would draw a parallel to what we're trying to do in climate change. Now, it would have been much better if we could have started doing these things 30 years ago, mm-hmm. but this is the best chance we have now. I mean, best time to plant a tree was 20
there's definitely lots of ways that we can draw links between what we're both interested in, Mm-hmm. But let me say that a lot of the potential drugs that will help people in the future are probably hidden in the coral reefs. Okay? Mm. There's papers that say that cures for cancer are in the reefs. Are in the deep ocean. Okay. So when those go, bye potential cures, potentially, and that's sad, Again, another way that destruction of the coral reefs will affect us, But I would just add, you were right about ocean acidification. I would just add that what happens is the carbonic acid that is produced when carbon dioxide interacts with water, that dissociates, right, into, it produces hydrogen ions. Okay. And it ultimately leads to the production of bicarbonate. Okay. And bicarbonate is something that animals with shells, they don't really like it too much. They need carbonate. Okay. That carbonate, unfortunately, binds with hydrogen to produce bicarbonate, and those animals can't use the bicarbonate to make their shells. So the thing that they need, in order to survive, is disappearing too. You have studies that have shown how that change in pH, okay, which is the result of, carbon dioxide entering the water, produces bicarbonate, reduces the amount of carbonate, and can kill off things like pteropods, snails, and you can see photographs of their shells being eroded, again, another animal that's probably going to suffer just because it has a shell. Mm.
So what about clams? Would they be in a similar
boat? That too. And ocean acidification will affect corals in that way too. They have a calcium carbonate skeleton, Right. They need carbonate.
Again, I would find it really depressing to be a marine biologist at this time. How do you stay balanced? You get
I'm not gonna lie, man, it's hard. Okay, so it's hard. I'll tell you, right? Because and we watch lots of movies with the kids. Mm-hmm. We watched Chasing Coral. Have you seen Chasing Coral?
No, I heard about that recently, though. I have to check it out.
Yeah, we had actually one of the guys who's a star of that movie called Zach Regal. He's a diver. Mm-hmm. He escaped our students last week. We escaped him.
That's super neat.
And he's got thousands and thousands of Instagram followers.
Yeah.
So all the kids were like, yo, this is a celebrity. They were in awe watching this man on the screen.
Yeah.
But he started crying in the movie, because of things like this, and that's someone who spends his entire life studying corals and coral reefs, But there's lots of things that, you can do, even as a coral reef biologist, idea is now to take corals, okay, raise them in aquariums, okay, and then put them back onto the reef,
like a nursery.
Like a nursery, okay. To plant them ourselves, Some species obviously are going to respond harder than others, okay? So it's about doing the groundwork to find out which ones are more resilient, and maybe put those ones back on the reef,
Are there any attempts to, and this is just spitballing, I have no idea if there are there any attempts to genetically modify coral to make them more resilient in these acidifications?
Yeah, it's not really my field, but I've heard that is happening, So that would be cool to kind of look at that more, One thing he told us, right, is that the aquarium environment, can be really, really, really useful, we have an aquarium in the classroom, and one of the kids asked the questions like, how much am I really learning about marine biology by studying animals in this aquarium, right? And it's a good question because it's a glass tank, right? This is a 90-gallon glass tank, where conditions are obviously very different in the real oceans. But you can learn so much, right? That then if that study can be replicated in the oceans, via camera technology, right? Or whatever, via just catching animals and then looking at them on a ship, we're progressing science in that way. So a lot of it actually begins with observing things in an aquarium.
Very neat. And do you guys perform like little experiments on the aquarium here, or you view that as unethical? You're very attached to some of the fish you have in there?
I mean, so mostly what we do, right? In fact, really all we do is observe them and monitor the conditions, We have cameras set up, okay, to observe their behavior. We have invertebrates such as crabs, and there's lots of things that you can look at with the crabs, which are really cool, We're not currently doing this, but just to let you know that people have trained hermit crabs how to ring bells. What? The ring bell is when they want to get fed.
That's pretty neat.
That would be cool. We're looking into getting a decorator crab right now. Did you hear about that?
No.
Decorator crab.
Maybe I saw it in a Planet Earth once, but it was long ago.
You put them in the tank, and they walk around picking up bits and pieces to fashion themselves with. And their body has like this, like what's like Velcro, right? Kind of similar to Velcro on their shell. And they pick up pieces of coral and stick the coral to them. And they walk around this big sort of like massive community of living organisms on a crab.
That's super neat. Is that a defense mechanism or a mating?
Camouflage.
Oh, okay. And then they just like sit down when a predator goes by.
But it's really funny. Watch the YouTube videos. It's really funny because sometimes the crab just decides that he doesn't like that one anymore. Like that was so last week, and takes that coral off and puts another one on.
Crab style. If you got two of them, would they start to emulate each other? Maybe.
Yeah. If they don't like fight, that's one of the problems with crabs. Like I think as a general rule, having two male crabs together is a really bad idea.
I think my brother and I had that
when
we were younger. We had two hermit crabs, and then his pulled the claw off of mine and stole its shell, and mine died. That was so sad.
That's how it goes.
Anyways, we're getting a little distracted. It's all good though.
But I mean, that's just an example of something that we can show the kids here at SSMV that probably they would never learn about otherwise. Like next week, we're doing this observations to really see which items or which materials the decorator crab likes to put on him. Likes to wear. That would be so cool. I don't know if there's too many studies like that, and if that could possibly be published, maybe, and it will lead to further studies, looking at that in the oceans, and when someone does that, you might, this is all entering new questions all the time. That's science, right? Yep. New questions. Okay, we've answered that one, but what's the next one?
Yep, you never stop. Constant curiosity, and I think that's what draws a lot of people to these fields. So what, I know you're wearing many hats. So not only do you teach kids, but you're doing active research yourself, right? What is that on at the moment? What you don't have to say too much. I know if you have something that's pending in publication or you're writing the paper.
That's cool.
We know how we have to be secret in science. It's really sad. It is really sad that you kind of have to.
Why do you think we need to be secret?
Well, at least in my field, especially, things are somewhat competitive, and in that you won't get funding for something, or you won't have as good of a chance for funding if you aren't the first to show something. So if you were the first to show this thing, then your next funding opportunity is probably a lot more likely to get funded. And I would imagine in marine biology, funding might be a little more scarce, and that might be an issue too, right?
Yeah.
What's your perception on that? And for my case, I would just rather all the knowledge be out there and we're constantly communicating. And I think it's getting to that point because we can actively collaborate. So like two labs that were working on the same thing can connect over the internet now and say, hey, we have this data, you have that data, let's publish a paper together. Versus, oh, we have to beat each other out and we're like both in our own corner.
I mean, I know. I think that's changing, Yeah. So let me just say one thing about that and then I'll answer your question, which is actually about what I'm working on. There are new journals now, right? Like PeerJ and stuff like that, right? PeerJ is more like an open one, People can go on there, and it's not so much like just one discipline, You can publish a bunch of papers, within biology, in PeerJ, but it has a really big reach now, Already it's been going for just, a short time. I think probably a few years, I can't tell you the year exactly, but it has a big following and it has a good impact factor, So what they're trying to do is really make things a little bit more transparent, That's definitely one way that, because some of these journal houses are charging big money.
Yep.
Right? Big, just to avoid your pictures being black and white. Like, come on, man. It should maybe be, the case of like, you shouldn't have to pay so much money, just for other people to be able to read your very important discovery about science. Right. The publishing houses are supposed to be on our site, pushing education forward. But it's not really doing that when they charge us thousands of dollars to put our papers out there. Mm-hmm. So I want to change that.
And it's also hard for the average person to reach these papers unless they're open access. And not all of them are open access, especially the most intriguing ones.
How many times the kids come to me like, Dr. Grigor, I couldn't get it because it's $40. Because the $40 is like that number, right? Is that in your field? It's like on many of the journal houses.
Or even 50.
50, 40,
50 is kind of standard in a lot
but we were told, maybe I shouldn't say that. But anyway, but I don't want these kids, trying to learn about science and research to have to pay that kind of money. But fortunately, they are associated with Vanderbilt and by now having like Vanderbilt credentials.
Excellent. Okay.
They can actually get the same access I have. Nice. They have a Vanderbilt email.
Yeah, that's a huge boon. That's something I underestimated when I was an undergraduate student, definitely. And then I had a brief gap between my undergraduate career and then my PhD career. And I just realized, I lost access to all of these incredible journals. It's really sad. Definitely something I would love to fix in the field as a whole. And we're probably going to have a discussion on that, Ian and Julian.
Cool.
Some ways to fix it. And hopefully we can talk to some science policy people. But thank you for your viewpoints on that.
Yeah. I mean, I need to see that change too. And you see more of it, with people like using YouTube, having Twitter accounts, Facebook. I love that, right?
Yep.
You can go now like #SciComm and stuff like that on Twitter, right. And you can see a lot that really inspires you about making research more transparent, about reaching out to people and trying to bridge that gap, to reach new people, and we're doing that better than we used to do.
It's hard as a scientist, I will say. We're not formally trained in it generally, and it is great that you're already getting these kids like straight out of high school. They're going to go into phenomenal careers, and they're going to be ready to be transparent and to be an access point to the public. It's really, I'm so glad you're doing that. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
It's extremely inspiring. So how can people reach you and reach you have a blog about your work here in the school?
Yeah, so there is, so there's a couple of different Facebook and Twitter pages. On Facebook, let me talk about the Aquarium pages first, okay? The Aquarium pages are generally run by the students, okay? And they give updates on new animals that we add, tell people about the animals and other organisms too, not just animals, and that's available on Facebook at SSMV Aquarium. Just type in SSMV Aquarium, okay? Twitter at SSMV Aquarium, okay? Instagram SSMV Under the Sea.
Nice.
There's pictures of like our fish, and they're trying to put like cute pictures of a diamond goby and stuff. That's a cool one because he sifts the sand, so he got like big attention from the kids earlier on. Like he goes through the tank and like picks up sand, and then he removes the good stuff, right? And gets rid of the sand, and you see this. Sometimes he spits the sand out, right? And other times it comes from behind the scale slits. And it's like this kind of like constant, like it's kind of like a sand factory. What he actually does is he creates all these microhabitats for the other fish. So he makes like holes under the rocks, and then the fish end up, oh, thanks, I'll take this one, you know? So things like the Instagram are allowing people to see pictures like that.
Definitely. I saw you guys just got a yellow tang. It's really flashy, right? Maybe not so recently, but
yeah, that's right. And we also have a Vanderbilt aquarium blog.
Okay. Yeah, I can tell us all of these in the show notes. For those listening, they will be there by the time you listen to it, so you can just click the links. But yeah, wanted to give you a chance to plug it real quick because I know you guys are making that effort to just show people what you're doing.
Yeah, let me say as well. I mean, that's awesome, man. And let me say that our aquarium project is entirely funded by donations. Okay, so we were able to obtain like $3,000 from parents, families, and friends, you know, in order to pay for the hardware. This only because of that, you know. Yeah. And we managed to pay some of it, you know, out of instructional supplies. But we constantly try to. Right now, we're still trying to source funds for the general maintenance. Okay, now that means buying chemicals, buying food. It means getting this guy, maintenance guy called the reef doctor, to come once a month and help us out. You know, if there's any problems, because like when you have more and more fish or more animals, there's more and more things that can go wrong.
Right.
Okay. So he's always telling us something new every time, you know, and there's always like a new device that he can help us install, you know, to clean the water a little bit better. I mean, the kids are learning about this in the process, and ultimately through his help and obviously mine, we want the kids to be like really efficient at looking after their own aquarium in the end. But that process takes time, and there's a contract. Sure. So we pay $150 a month for that contract. We also want to buy new fish to keep this kind of like, you know, educational, you know. So if anybody's interested in supporting that initiative, we have a GoFundMe page, right? We're looking for $3,000, and we already collected about 900 of that.
Nice.
And that's on GoFundMe.com/SSMV-aquarium-maintenance-funds.
Okay. Yeah, I'll toss that in the show notes as well. Okay. It'd be great if we could get support out to really just, it's one of the more hands-on science communication and science outreach things that I've ever seen. And it's really inspiring just to see the involvement of kids. I looked at the Facebook page and the Instagram, and they look really excited to be there. And
it's all like pictures of them like actually acclimating the fish, right?
Yeah.
So it's like, then not only are they learning about it, but they feel a sense of responsibility.
Yep.
None of these kids is really wanting to the fish to kind of, you know, suffer or anything like that, you know. So they take real care. They take real time in it, you know. They do everything properly, you know. And the proper acclimation process should really take hours, you know, because it's come from someone else's tank, and you don't really know what the water was like in there. And you don't want to add water from someone else's tank into your own one.
Oh yeah, you got to quarantine, right?
Yeah, so you do have to quarantine first, okay? But even when you're acclimating, you have to expose them to the right temperature, you know, for maybe 20 minutes. And then you've got to slowly add water from your tank into the bag that the animal's in before it can be placed into the aquarium. You know, lots of things people don't even think about.
So with that contaminated water thing, is that like zooplankton? Are there some bad zooplankton, some good ones? You don't want the bad ones? Or are there bacteria? What's the main concern?
It's the one of the major problems is dinoflagellate parasites.
Oh.
So okay, so parasites, you know, it's same kind of like parasites that affect us, you know, when we go to the wrong place, right? You know, these can definitely affect the fish in bad ways.
Okay.
There's something called ick. Well, actually, ick, right, is kind of like a bracket term for like lots of diseases that fish can have. You know, ICH. I guess you know where it comes from. It comes from like ichthology, right? The study of fish.
Oh.
So ICH, and one of the ones that can hurt them is this one called Udinium, velvet swimming disease, and that really can stress out the fish, and it could ultimately kill it. You know. So you don't want to do that. And problem is, somebody who, you know, doesn't look after their tank too well or whatever, they could get these diseases quite easily, you know. It's actually kind of normal to have some sort of parasite in there, you know. Some of them the fish can fight off, other ones are harder.
And acidification of the water may stress the fish out.
It's possible, yeah.
We can kind of tie this all in. I just realized we didn't follow up on your research, so we kind of left it.
Yeah. So there's so much to talk about today, man.
I know, yeah. I wish we could have hours, and hey, maybe I can come back at some point and we can
Yeah, so I'll briefly tell you, because I told you that I was working on zooplankton, okay? Yep. You know, and then I told you I was working on arrowworms. What I was working on in my PhD was about the ecology of these arrowworms. Mm-hmm. And it was looking at how free species that live in the Arctic can coexist, okay? I published a paper on the ecology of two species, which are called Parasita elegans and Uchronia hamata, okay? Mm-hmm. Living together in the Canadian Arctic. And what you found is that one species, Parasita elegans, generally, for much of the year, live shallower than one Uchronia hamata, which live deeper. Okay, and we also found that one might use oil supplies, okay, an oil vacuole that it has in its body to help it reproduce in the wintertime. Okay, it's like fat supplies, you know, and maybe only one species has that option and the other one doesn't. And to many people, they'd be like, okay, so what? Why does that matter? But it matters in, again, understanding the resilience of each of these individual animals towards climate change. Mm-hmm. And it also matters towards understanding the role of each one in the food web, you know? So definitely. And then, of course, it's just interesting to study animals that have never been studied before or infrequently studied before, certainly in the locations that I studied them. Mm-hmm. So then the final paper for my thesis was looking at the feeding of those two species I just talked about. And again, I found differences. I saw that one species seems to be more omnivorous than the other one. Okay, and chaetognaths in general, arrowworms in general, are generally thought of as strict carnivores. But the evidence in my PhD says that that's not the case. One species is probably much more omnivorous than the other one. And there's lots and lots of data that I show in that paper to confirm that, you know, from gut contents, fatty acids, stable isotopes. Lots of things all show that, yeah, one species is more omnivorous than the other one. Again, that information is really useful just to tell people, you know, what you found before was useful, but I'm adding to it, you know? And together, we're pushing this field forward.
Right. It's like an exploration, you know, being a primitive explorer. So to think about their relevance, you think the omnivorous species might be a little more resilient, or they might be better able to adapt to climate change, and maybe those would take over in a warming climate, or you might not be able to say that just.
So one thing that really actually, it's kind of like a small detail, right? But actually it sounds like a small detail, but it's kind of important, you know? Right. I read some papers that talked about the sinking rates of zooplankton poo. Okay. And that's
libraries.
That's real. So if a zooplankton eats prey, right? Normal animal prey, okay? Its fecal pellets will generally sink slower than the one that eats algae, okay? And the problem with that is that when the fecal pellets sink more slowly, they can be remineralized. They can be used up by bacteria in the water. They might not get down to the bottom, okay? But when it sinks faster, okay, as in the case of an omnivore, that fecal pellet might actually reach the bottom of the water and actually end up in the seabed, sequestering carbon.
Oh, okay. So losing some of these species might be really, really bad. It could accelerate. So we see a lot of these things in positive.
So
feedback.
what you eat definitely affects your role in the carbon cycle.
That's potentially really important. How many of these little worms are in the Arctic? Like, what do you know the biomass? Or I'm trying.
That's a really good one too. That's a good one too, because arrowworms, right, are very abundant. Okay, so when you look at plankton samples, okay, from loads of places, definitely where I was sampling, you will always find arrowworms. Okay. You'll always find copepods and arrowworms. Some of the other groups of zooplankton, like sea angels, okay. See if you can find pictures of sea angels for your audience to look at, because they're like the most beautiful zooplankton.
Definitely, yeah, look them up.
Things like that, things like the snails with the shells that I talked about, you'll get them some of the time, but you won't get them all the time. You get arrowworms all the time, and you get big numbers of them. So just based on those two things that I told you there, and the fact that, you know, they produce these fecal pellets, that process might actually be really important, you know?
Lots of little changes.
For real.
If we can circle back. Yeah, we were tying in a running theme here. That's really fascinating. I had no idea. So I'm trying to visualize as well what this process is actually like. You take a boat out to the Arctic Sea and you start scooping up water. How's that done? Do you go diving down to the bottom sometimes?
So I didn't dive in the Arctic. I have dived a lot in the past, but I wasn't ready for it.
Yeah, don't blame me.
Diving in Scotland was cold enough for me. But people do dive, you know, and they can collect samples like that. How we used to do it would be just to put nets in the water You get a ship, as you rightly said. In our case, we're usually using Coast Guard vessels,
Nice.
Canadian Coast Guard vessels. One called the Handson, specifically, massive big icebreaker. You'd stop at a station. You'd put these massive nets, monster nets. We actually called one the monster, into the water, and that would be like very long net with a meter squared opening, okay, and maybe a 500 micron mesh. That's the size of the holes. And you put that down, you send it down to the bottom on a winch, you'd bring it back up again. And both the size of the opening and the size of the mesh would really affect what animals you get.
Mm-hmm.
And then you collect that, you'd bring it onto the ship, you'd sort out the animals maybe into different containers, take them back to the lab and spend years analyzing them.
So how many trips have you taken to the Arctic to do this?
So
how frequent does that happen?
So in the Canadian Arctic, they typically do yearly trips, okay, with the big universities up there. Okay, an organization called ArcticNet. That would normally happen in the summertime. I took like 3 or 4 of those, okay, and then and the longest that I spent was 2014 when I was there for 2 months. But then I lived in the European Arctic in Svalbard for like an entire year when I was in my bachelor's.
How was that?
That was weird. I mean, it was awesome. Like, I shouldn't say weird, weird in an awesome way, because surreal is a better word, right?
Okay.
You have no idea what it's like to go through months of sheer darkness until you actually go through months of sheer darkness. You can't read about it. You can't watch a YouTube video. It doesn't matter. You don't know how you're going to feel until you don't see the sun for months, right? We were told during the polar night, okay, which happens where I was in Svalbard, okay, 81 degrees north. Well, 78. I was actually at 78 degrees north, but I was sometimes sampling up at 81. We were told one way to help you in the polar night, is to have like a UV lamp, okay? Because not having enough light is bad for your levels of vitamins in your body.
Vitamin D, yeah. Everyone always talks about that.
Yeah, for sure. So definitely that was something that you need to really like think about, Similarly, imagine it being like 3 o'clock in the morning and the sun being in the sky in the summer.
That is disorientating. Yeah.
It's weird. And then it's weird coming back again afterwards. Because then it's like, and for months, you want to go back there. Like, I think it was probably a combination of how different the environment was and how awesome my experiences were. I met a lot of people, from different countries. I got to go out onto the glaciers, onto the sea ice. I got to drive snowmobiles. I got to see polar bears. And in the process, learning all about the Arctic and why we should care about it. Mm-hmm. And then coming back to the city afterwards is a massive culture shock.
Got to get out there again sometime soon, maybe.
Totally, man. Totally. You should too.
Absolutely. I would love to. I
think you'd be really good in the Arctic, man, because that kind of like youthfulness, obviously passion, to learn about things, and being willing to try new things, go learn about other cultures. Go learn, do a bunch of activities that you wouldn't do otherwise. Like drive a snowmobile. Don't be scared to just jump in the deep end. But these are things that we don't really do we definitely don't do it here because there's no snow. But they're definitely experiences that you can only really have when you go to the polar regions. And I'm really thankful I got the chance.
Yeah, absolutely. It would be a great trip, definitely. But I'm a little worried about the dark months. Sure. I feel like that would drive me crazy. Was that the hardest thing for you, or?
That was kind of hard. It just takes some getting used to, but your body does get used to it. So what I would say is I was part of a good community when I was over there. I was studying at the university center in Svalbard. Okay. I don't know if I mentioned this, but Svalbard is a group of islands that belong to Norway. Okay. And it's Scandinavian. Yeah. And UNIS, this university, has students from Norway and from all over the world, but the classes are taught in English. Okay. And they do a really great job over there at supporting their students and helping them through that. We were in barracks with a bunch of other students and we had a lot of fun. There was, lots of work, but lots of making the most of our time up there as well. And when you come back, you try and stay in contact with those people. Obviously time goes by. That was 2009 when I came away from there. I don't talk to some of those students very much anymore. But we always like from time to time like each other's Facebook pages and say happy birthday to each other, and I'm pretty sure we'll continue to do that forever,
Yeah, and if you ever have a question for them, I'm sure they're there. Reach out. Yeah, I love the international friends that I've met so far, and everyone has a different perspective. So bringing all those together, and that's one of the things science can do too.
Sure.
Probably wouldn't be having this conversation otherwise, right?
Yeah. And things like social media are pretty much like the only way that we got in contact with each other.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. I think I don't even remember how I saw you guys, but it was glad I did. Thanks again, Dr. Grigor, for coming on.
No problem.
Before we wrap this up, I wanted to ask a couple more questions. One, and you might have already answered this in part, but I want to know how your learning, your experience, and your knowledge that you've gained throughout your PhD studies, throughout your postdoc, has changed the way that you look at everyday life, changed your behavior, and how has that changed you? How has that experience molded you, scientist?
Yeah, this is a really, really tough question.
I know, it's very open-ended.
It's a really tough question, but it's a great question at the same time, I definitely am more mature than I used to be, Thinking as a scientist is a skill that takes a long time, to develop, You might think you have it at the bachelor's, but maybe not, It does take, I think it probably takes grad school to really learn that autonomous thing, being independent, being left with a project, entirely by yourself, and you being entirely responsible for the success of it, and not success in your own terms, success in the eyes of other researchers that have been doing it for longer than you.
Who are going to grill you on it later.
Who are going to grill you on it, for a long time, For me, in French.
Really?
Yeah, in French, in ma viva.
That is a nightmare.
I did it half English, some French, but I was asked questions in French, So definitely things that, they're uncomfortable. You're going to have to go through a lot in grad school that's uncomfortable. You're going through it right now, but you come out the other side and you do feel like, wow, it's great that I achieved that, but it's even more than that you understand now that we have to be really careful, just saying things, things need to be verified and tested. It's not really so relevant to just say, I feel that that's happening, It was cold today, therefore global warming isn't real.
Right.
Science teaches you that what you just said there is wrong, okay? And if you say that, okay, you clearly, unfortunately, don't understand the difference between weather and climate. Scientists can help you understand that, but don't shut them out, I'm glad I was able to learn that mostly by going through grad school,
Yeah, it's been a great experience for me thus far, and I'm only 2 years in, so
yeah.
I know I'm going to run into some rough patches, but that's part of the game. Do you have any advice for people who want to get into science, who maybe want to look up some of these programs that might be starting around their space, or anyone just looking to get better acquainted with marine biology, perhaps?
Yeah, definitely follow things like Scripps Institute of Oceanography, right? Follow reef.org, okay, which is in Florida, which is all about the coral reefs, okay? Watch Chasing Coral. Definitely watch those nature documentaries. Chasing Coral is a great one because it's really like good at reaching out to people in a really understandable way. They use a lot of like comparisons. They talk about a coral reef like a big city, with like one new building going in, it equals like, some sort of like multi-layered complex environment, At the same time, visit the oceans. The oceans, are actually not that far from most people, It's a bit more difficult if you're right in the middle of the continent, right? But then you can go to one of the lakes, right? And you won't learn about the oceans, but you'll learn about aquatic life, so see it for yourself. That's what I'm saying. Reach out to your schools, because, one thing that's happening here in Nashville is that the schools are making quite good efforts to have like gardens, where the students can grow their own things, and in the process learning how to look after the environment, learning how to support species, and feeling a sense of responsibility, just like what I'm doing with the aquarium. You can do that outside your school.
Absolutely. Yeah, those things are cropping up everywhere, and I love that, the hands-on learning, because that's what really would have gotten me into science earlier, I think. I like the hands-on stuff, and science seemed really abstract and very far removed, so showing people how it is actually done. visualize it is great. So we're going to toss all those links we mentioned in the show notes for you guys. If you have any papers you want to send me, I can toss them in the show notes, and
Cool.
We can see if we can get people access. If they're behind paywalls, then they can get into other universities.
No, they're. I think for the most part, what I would really like to push is maybe let people know more about what we're trying to do with our aquarium. You know.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then I have a bunch of like YouTube videos that I've made in the past that maybe I could send you. I made one called Underdogs of the Arctic, and it gave more details about these animals that I was telling you about, you know, underdogs, because whilst they're really important, people don't know about them.
The understated arrow worms.
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, I knew nothing about them coming in here. So this is like a full class on marine biology.
I also made kind of like conscious decision to get a lot of tattoos with pictures of plankton and animals on me, you know, so people can learn about them by looking at me.
Visual library.
Library, yeah.
Does that help you like keep motivated? Yes. Remember what you're working on, sort of thing, or?
Yeah, you know, and I think it just goes hand in hand with the passion that I have to learn about these animals and help protect them, you know. Yeah. Over time, you just start like, you know, it's the same for people that are into music, right? You know, it becomes a major part of their life. You know, I think that's another thing. If you say, how did science change me? So it became my life, you know?
Yep.
It wasn't just work anymore. It became how I thought on a daily basis. My head is always thinking about some question I can answer. It's always thinking about, have I done this with the aquarium? You know, could I do this with the aquarium? You know, and that's all changed, you know, by going through grad school and really becoming more of a scientist. Mm-hmm. You know?
Yeah, that's a great perspective. I think I'm noticing the same things happening.
You're seeing it
myself. Yeah, I've definitely been curious and always wanted to like poke things, but I get more tactical. I get better at asking those questions, so I'm not just asking random questions that never get answered. I actually answer a lot of these questions for myself now.
What I'm doing now, and I think I mentioned this earlier, but it allows me to be maybe even a bit more creative than I was able to be in my PhD. Okay, so we can pretty much say, hey, why don't we get this crab? Why don't we look at that crab? We could go to the local like fish supplier, fish store, and we could get an animal, you know, because it's interesting to learn about. In that way, we're not censored, and I do like this program for that. A lot of the ideas that we do, or almost all of them, are what the kids want to do. Dr. Grigor, could we get a decorator crab? Can we get a pom-pom crab? A pom-pom crab is like, this is awesome. This is a crab that has these gloves, right? That are like boxing gloves, but they're living anemones.
I always wonder what those were. I think I've seen them like, dancing around. That's so cool. Okay, so they're actually, do they eventually grow into big ones? Do they like?
Yeah, they grow, but sometimes they're like stolen by a neighbor.
Crabs are ruthless.
Man. They are, no lie. So yeah, so that's something you can definitely get involved in, and you know, these different projects, you know, to just like answer questions, find out about stuff.
Yeah. Be curious.
Yeah.
Thanks again for coming on, Dr. Grigor.
No problem.
Really appreciate it. I'm really excited to see this fish tank now. See all these crabs and fish. So I'm gonna go take a look at that. Yeah, I really appreciate this opportunity. You let me in your lab and space.
Thank you, man. It was great to talk to you.
Thanks for listening all.